Good afternoon. We are going to kick off. There are two more interventions between you and cocktails. And therefore, I can promise that these are going to be, not that the others weren't absolutely fascinating and fantastic, but this is just going to reach a crescendo of excitement and stimulation in the course of this. I will say that in putting together this really august panel, we had 4 participants. You'll notice that there are 3. Claire Farrell, who was one of the original founders of Extinction Rebellion, has done a bunch of work, has fallen ill. But by some quirk of fate, there were 2 Claires and 2 Bens on this panel. So now we have 2 Bens and 1 Claire, which makes things a little easier. What I'm going to do is ask each of the panelists just to say 30 seconds about who they are and why they have the credentials and expertise to be on the panel, and then we're going to kick off.
Ben Scott. I am the CEO of a global nonprofit called Reset Tech, which for the last 5 years has worked on the problem of digital threats to democracy in the way in which digital media markets undermine our ability to solve problems in democratic societies.
Good afternoon. My name is Claire Mellier. I'm head of research and practice at ISWI Foundation, and we are designers and evaluators of deliberative and participatory processes, and we've done quite a lot and too many to know what are the limits and the strength of these processes. So I'll hopefully share some of that.
Hi everybody, great to see so many people. My name is Ben Tolhurst. I'm a director at Business Declares. We're a network organization, and alongside that we've also looked at how we might apply deliberative democratic processes to the business world.
Okay, so to set up the conversation for today's panel, we've heard a sort of outline from Lord Turner about where we're likely to go with the creation and destruction of jobs in the labor market. We've explored different industry sectors about what's likely to emerge. We've heard a perspective from Africa. We've spoken about the skills agenda. And what we've sort of the elephant in the room for how we promote just transitions and how we get to more inclusive economies is this pesky thing called human beings and citizens, and how we properly engage with stakeholders and people in societies and communities to make them understand and feel that these transitions work for them. And where there are difficulties and sacrifices and things aren't always going to be linear, and they're going to be trade-offs between how you get to net zero, how you create jobs, and how you do so in a way that's economically inclusive, and where they're going to be winners and losers, how to do that in a way that produces informed democratic consent and tries to fight against the polarizing, fractious moment that we see in so many of our democracies. And so what we're going to try and do in this panel is not solve all of that, because goodness knows if we could in one panel we'd go and do it, but try and suggest to you ways of thinking about this that actually takes democratic processes, informed consent, and information seriously, so that we design that into this interrelated endeavor that we're all working on. So that's the frame of today. And I'm going to ask Ben Scott to kick off because, as I said in my introduction, information is upstream from democracy. And I think we've all felt that the world we live in is increasingly a fact-free world, a world where we live in echo chambers, where we're increasingly we have disputes about things that in previous eras we all agreed were things that were beyond dispute. And so I think Ben's going to give us a little bit of a introduction to what the problem is and how we might go about solving, reforming, or repairing our information markets. Ben.
Thanks, Paul. I'm not going to spend the whole time admiring the problem, but I am going to describe it a little bit without getting in the weeds of how digital media technologies work. But let me set out the premise that every panel that in this conference has concluded that we have a good idea what the answers are, but they're really hard things. There are hard things that governments have to do, there are hard things that businesses have to do, there are hard things that communities have to accept. How do you get people to do hard things? You have to persuade them. How do you persuade people? Well, you have in classical democratic theory, you all get together, you agree on a set of facts, and you argue over what's the best way to interpret the facts to get from point A to point B. But what if you don't all accept the same facts? And what if you aren't all in the same places to talk about those facts? And what if you don't trust the people who are delivering you the arguments about the facts? The whole system breaks down, and you can't solve any problems. This is not just an issue for a climate policy agenda. This is what's happening underneath democratic systems on every issue. This is why we're experiencing such volatility in the democratic world all across the globe. You look into your phone every morning and constantly, because you're addicted, because they're made to addict you, and what do you see? You don't see a reflection of the reality around you. You see a distortion machine that is personalized for you. So let me challenge you with this. How do you know what you know? Classical media theory tells you there are two ways you know what you know. One is you consume media of some kind, television, print, radio, billboards. And then you talk about it with the people who you know around you. Pre-internet, those two things happened in different places. You consumed the media while sitting in front of your TV or at your breakfast table with the newspaper, and then you talked about the things that you learned when you got to work or while you're sitting at the lunch table or in the pub at the end of the day. Now, you consume the media and you talk about the media in the same Twitter feed, on the same Facebook page, in the comment section at the YouTube video, and you shout at people, and they shout back, and you don't even know who they are. And the order in which you receive information, and the reason why you're getting this information as opposed to that information, is no longer decided by journalists or even anyone who gives a damn about the ethics of what publics need to know to run a democratic society. They're run by computers, whose only job is to capture the maximum amount of your attention possible in order to sell advertisers access to your eyeballs. And that which captures our attention isn't necessarily that which helps us perform better as citizens. So we're facing an information market that is literally designed to stop us from achieving results in a classical democratic civic deliberation. So we have to hack that system. I could sit here all day long and tell you about all the industrial policy that we're working on in the technology policy space. That's another 20-year project. We're going to need to do that too. But right now, we have to address the system that we've got. And how do we do that? How do you persuade people in an environment where every day they look into a funhouse mirror when they're trying to interpret the world? And most of the people, most of the time, don't even accept the same facts that interpret the world around them. How do you deal with that situation? So we can take some lessons here from what's happening in the world of political campaigns. And I'll use the US as an example because there's more money than God in the US political system right now trying to solve this problem. Tens of millions of dollars are being spent per day right now to try to address this problem. Here are the lessons that I think we need to put on the table for this session. Number one, we need to understand better what the heck is going on in this distorted funhouse mirror of digital media. We need to conduct threat intelligence. We need to monitor and learn about what people are talking about and where the narratives are going that lead people away from the solutions that we believe are necessary in order to save us from extinction. High stakes. The second thing we need to do is we need to build a new kind of communication strategy that doesn't rely on top-down communications, broadcasts on Radio 4, speeches by the Prime Minister, op-eds in The Observer. Those kinds of things work for us. We are not the normative case. We need to go out into communities and recognize that despite the fact that time and space have been eliminated by digital communications, actually people still talk a lot locally about local issues. What campaigns have done in the political space is they've built these elaborate cellular infrastructures of influencers who are popular in particular topics, themes, channels, localities, groups, and they pay them to pay attention to the issues that they think are important. There's not a TikToker in America with more than 10,000 followers who isn't being offered money every day to say certain things or to post certain links in their profiles. This is the future, whether we like it or not, right now. We need to operate in this space because this is where everybody is going who wants to persuade people in the digital world. We also need to get better at telling stories. We need to stop speaking in paragraphs and in prosaic facts and figures. That's not what's winning political debates these days. We need to come up with better slogans. We need to come up with better stories about people who win in the communities and not only those who have to sacrifice. And we need to figure out ways to go and take these messages into the spaces where people are. And people aren't in news consumption spaces anymore, they're in entertainment consumption spaces. So how do you make sure that along with your sports podcast and your makeup TikTok video and your Taylor Swift report, you're also getting a little bit of info about climate, and you're talking to people who also care about that while they also care about Taylor Swift. These are different kinds of communication strategies that we are only beginning to understand and deploy as a community of wonks focused on wonkish things like the green jobs transition and skill building and educational institutions that can serve those needs. So I'm going to stop there and say this is a big, hairy problem that we're dealing with, and it's set against us, but it is not unhackable.
So before I go to Claire, I just want to do a follow-up on that question. It seems to me we have two choices. We could either take the information systems that we have and play the game more effectively, contest more effectively, right? Take the things that cause virality on Twitter and think of what's the viral story to tell about the perils of climate change, and don't tell wonderful graphs, show graphs like Adair Turner showed, but show 60-second bites of tornadoes ripping through people's homes and then say, here's a solution, right? So hack the systems with the same methods that are used for more divisive ends? Or are you saying that there are actually ways to re-architect those systems themselves in a way that cause them to be less polarizing and bifurcating? And what would it take for us to do that? Or is the genie out the bottle and we're not going to be able to re-architect the systems that we now have?
So it's not an either or. So we have to re-architect the systems, but that's going to take a lot of time. Because to re-architect the systems, you need to change the business model. To change the business model, you need industrial policy in the technology sector, and you need to force some of the richest companies in the history of the world to change their profit-making behavior. And as all of you know who built this climate movement, that ain't easy. So that's going to take time. And you'll see incremental progress. You see it now when it comes to child safety. People are pissed off about their kids being addicted to phones and being led astray every time they look in them, and you're starting to see some reactions in the industry. You'll see some of those changes in other sectors as well, but it's going to go slow. In the meantime, I'm not advocating that we should participate in a fear-based, anxiety-based communication strategy, although from time to time, we can't reject it out of hand. What I am saying is we need to think about how do you tell a story that makes people want to listen. And it makes it doubly hard if you're not willing to engage in the politics of fear, anxiety, and hate. But it's not impossible. You can get in front of people and talk to them in ways that make them interested in what you have to say. And part of it is about engaging with them as real people and getting into their communities and working with those who they know and trust. It's the old trusted messenger strategy. I'm much more likely to be persuaded by you if you're telling me something I don't want to hear, if I know you, And I know that in the past you've been a reliable person. Whereas if you just show up in my community and you tell me that I have to quit my job and stop eating meat and start recycling, who are you?
Okay, we're going to return to this, but I'm going to now come on to Claire. Tell us a little bit about your work with citizens' assemblies in particular, because I think this is one of the more interesting and innovative forms of democratic inclusion and consultation that have been applied in the climate space, nascent, early, experimental, but potentially promising.
Yes, thank you. And Ben set up, I think, the systemic issues we're facing. And with Citizens' Assembly, in a way, we're trying to apply the principle of deliberative democracy with real people, not online. So bringing people together to deliberate on complex policy discussions, grapple with trade-offs, and come up with some solutions, recommendations that are the fruit of collective intelligence. So in a snapshot, a Citizens' Assembly is a group of everyday people that are representative of a population. So it could be in your local community, in your village, in your region, in your country, or as we did it before COP26 in Glasgow, at the global level. And that was the first time it was done at the global level. And just to give you a sense of what it looked like, it was 100 citizens from all around the world, selected by sortition, which is the technical term for civic lottery, representative of the world. So you had 70% of these assembly members who used to live on the $10 a day. So that's the figure we're dealing with, for instance. 50% women, 50% men. So that's the important piece, the diversity, and people who are very different from this audience in this room, who are actually not engaged normally in political discussions. And you bring them and you support them to take part in these processes, because often, you know, they're single moms really struggling to make ends meet, and they need to be compensated, so you cover their costs, their childcare, and all of this. So this is briefly, and if you want more about citizens' assemblies, there are lots of resources out there. What they're doing is really powerful in terms of bringing people together with different views and addressing polarization. So what Ben is talking about is the polarization online. But the more I facilitate these processes, the more I realize that when you bring people together in real life, you realize that actually they've got much more in common, and they realize it themselves. They find common ground despite the different political opinions and others. So what we've seen, you know, in the last, I would say there's been a wave of these citizens' assemblies, and partly in the UK, thanks to the work of movements like Extinction Rebellion, who have brought this into much more mainstream, audiences. But they are still quite niche, these processes. I was one of the researchers who observed the French Convention Citoyenne, which you probably have heard about, which was commissioned by Macron himself, led to a lot of, you know, national discussions on the climate transition. But what we see is that they are still niche, and they are still very much what I call invited spaces, top down. So commissioned by power holders with a particular framing and a particular process by which they then land in a system that is still, you know, very polarized. So what we've seen is very ambitious recommendation in the French process. And at the end of the Climate and Resilience Bill, which was the output from that process, you've got watered down, cherry-picked recommendation translated into legislation. So we are at the moment, I think, at the cusp of these assemblies potentially creating more disillusionment, because people get really disappointed that they invest, they are activated, there's this self and collective efficacy that you experience through these processes, but then they land in this system that is polarized because of the media, the role of the media, social and others. You've got the power of the lobbies. We've seen that in France. You've got the system, the political system, that is not suited to receive these recommendations. So what I'm really now interested personally, and we're going to be in New York next week for the UN Summit of the Future, where we've got the Brazilian government backing the Global Citizens Assembly becoming a permanent feature of global governance. And they really want to reclaim the COP process as the COP of the people in the tradition of the Brazilian participatory, tradition. And so what we're trying to do now is say, look, we can't just have top-down processes. We need, as citizens and as movements, we need to reclaim our power, and we need bottom-up deliberative assemblies. And that's what, unfortunately, Claire Farrell was going to talk about with all the work they're doing now with a project called the Humanity Project, which is very much about reclaiming that power and saying, look, power holders they don't have the power. We have the power as citizens, and we need to really honor that. And so, yeah, maybe we can talk a bit more about what the Humanity Project is doing, but I'm personally really interested in supporting this, because I think it needs to become a movement rather than processes that we are invited to contribute to and consultative. They need to have teeth, and they need to have impact and make change.
Can we just dig in a little bit about, like, on one level, I think most of us would be quite persuaded that if we took all of us in this room and we set out all of we had an example of how were we going to take a particular part of Britain and accelerate its path to renewables, and we had experts who came in who gave us the facts, and we said this is how much it's going to cost, and these are the trade-offs between cost A and cost B, and this is the infrastructure we're going to have to invest in. We're going to have smart grids that go back and forth, and they may have to go through farmer A's land and farmer B's land, but there's a collective benefit. And here are the yields, and here's the short-term benefits, here are the costs, and here's the long-term. And let's spend a day debating 5 or 6 different options. I feel that we probably would get better decisions than lobby special interest smoke-filled rooms in a Congress where people with power and money get to kind of corrupt a process. So I feel as though it would be a better process. The sort of traditional objection to citizens' assemblies are they're still small groups of people who may be deliberative and thoughtful, but they're not necessarily representative, and we have an anxiety of delegating real power to them. So we don't delegate real power, we give them advisory abilities, and it comes back to the place where the real power is, and then we dilute it down, and then everybody feels, well, wow, you just rubbed our noses in it a second time. So how do you square that circle? Greater deliberation and power in contexts where they're not necessarily representative in the way that we conceive of representation.
Well, we've written a piece which is called Getting Real about Citizens' Assemblies, and that's why it's looking at theories of change, power, and how do you bring in academic term, the maxi public into the conversation, because people at the moment, what we've seen and what's happened in Ireland, for instance, is that there was a citizens' assembly on abortion and gay marriage. Then it was sent back to, referendum. And so there was a direct connection between the mini public, the citizens' assembly, and the maxi public. But that, in the UK, people are now saying, because of the precedent of Brexit, referendums, let's not go there. And we know what's happened with Cambridge Analytica and how the discourse was actually really manipulated by what Ben is talking about. So what we're trying to do at ISWE and with the work we're doing with the Global Assembly and other processes is how do you bring this into popular culture? And we think there are different ways to doing this, how you bring basically the wider public. I think we need to have cultural engagement, so cultural figures to really get this message out there. So, and again, this is what Claire Fowle is doing with the work of Ardart and artists like Brian Eno and many others. If you look it up, you'll see that artists are trying to really work around this, around narratives. How do you take this niche concept of citizens' assembly into actually popular culture? So that's one thing. And the other thing I think is about what I was talking about bottom-up, and the work, I think, for me, of community assembly. So really trying to distribute all these processes in our community, really do the hard work in our, in our communities. It's hard. It's hard to be confronted with your neighbors who really don't think the same way you do. But that's where the real work, I think, is happening, especially in the face of, I'm going to use a really maybe controversial term in this room, but in the face of collapse. And resilience in our communities is going to be absolutely critical. So how do you prepare communities to grapple with what does that mean when you talk about food security in your community, when you've got, or energy security, the commons, how do you reclaim your energy supply, or water management? How do you make sure that actually maybe you stop paying your bills because the water companies are not doing their job, and as a community maybe you find ways of reclaiming your power? So it might sound really revolutionary, but I think it's actually what's needed right now.
We shall return to that as well. So Ben, I'd like you to come in. You've spent a time sort of valiantly, and I think from our pre-discussion, sometimes sort of beating your head against the wall, trying to engage the business community in various forms of dialogue and consultation. Would you reflect on that, but also on these two conversations, and build on it from a kind of a pathway forward perspective?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. And I think I'd like just to start by saying that what I'm interested in is taking the concepts of citizens' assemblies and deliberative democracy into the business world, and that means ultimately changing governance and changing business models. But just before I talk about that, let's just remind ourselves of the context that we're in. So we're in a polycrisis. We're in a misinformation crisis, as we've already heard. We're in a business landscape where businesses are, in some cases, trying to do their best, and in other cases are willfully blind. We're in a business context mired in acronyms around sustainability, TCNFDs, frameworks, SBTIs. We're in a context where the problems of collapse which we're in and which are coming thicker and faster are intellectualized in processes, in frameworks, in methodologies. I was recently at a very acclaimed sustainability conference where we had senior people looking at monetizing nature. We call nature ecosystem services, just like we call people human capital. Really? That conversation led into, is a bumblebee worth more than some pandas? This is the kind of intellectualized rubbish that is going on in the business world as a distraction from the reality of collapse. And this is what we need to start changing, and we need to start changing this fast. Now, businesses are, as we know, more powerful than governments. So businesses have to change. They have to become a force for good. And in some cases, of course, they are. But in most cases, they are not. And the way in which we need to change them is through governance. And we need to start looking at governance models in business. And we need to start changing the way that power is organized. And we need to start moving power, devolving power from the top to the many. And this is why I'm really interested in the concept of the things that Claire's been talking about. How can we take all the goodness and all the methodologies and the concepts of citizens and people's assembly and take them into the business world? And so myself and my colleague Rachel Pryor over there, give us a wave, we looked into how we might do this. And do you want me to go into this now, or do you want to come back to it?
Go for it.
Okay, so there are some patchy examples of where businesses, I think, have toyed with the concept of customer assemblies or some form of deliberative democracy, but it's been pretty sporadic. The one place that we found that this has really taken off is in France, with a movement called the CEC, which is the Convention des Entreprises pour le Climat. Thank you. Is that good enough? And this is a movement that brought together hundreds of businesses and basically focused around three main things. Some brutal truth-telling. Brutal truth-telling. This is what we need. You know, we are, as I said before, we are mired in concepts and methodologies, and we're turning blind eyes to racism and colonization. It's all hidden in the supply chains, but don't worry, because it's in the supply chains and we don't see it, so it's fine. This all needs to be exposed. So brutal truth-telling is a key point of this, by experts and proper information, not disinformation, who know what they're talking about. Then the movement talked about metrics and business models. So we've heard today, growth, growth, growth. What is growth? Do you really think, are you really sat there thinking that we can grow infinitely on a finite planet? What are people smoking if they're talking about endless growth? I'm sorry, but you know, this is a total nonsense. So the metrics that are all geared towards growth have to all change, because they are meaningless. And then the third thing that they did was they looked at kind of roadmaps and actions for going forward. So we found this working in France to great effect. So Rachel and I, we looked at how we could utilize these methodologies in the UK. And what we did was we looked at those methodologies in France, and we added in donor economics, and we framed this around a community resilience kind of topic. So what we said was, instead of a business saying, how can I maximize profit from you in this region, whatever region that is, we framed the question differently and said, how can we as a business maximize resilience, adaptation, and stability in the face of the collapse that we're in? So this is the kind of thing that we turned on its head, and that we were seeking to use the assemblies for. So we went out for funding, and the funders said, we thank you for your applications. It's all very interesting, but it doesn't fit our objectives at this time, but please send us some more information when you have it. So we went out to businesses, and they said, this is fantastic, but I wouldn't want to pay any money because it's a little bit tricky at the time. We're a bit in overwhelm. We got all these TCFDs and SBTIs and all this kind of ESG stuff to do, and there's a cost of living crisis, and at the time, you know, there was an election looming. And actually, between you and me, what happens if we do this and we get an answer we don't like? We're going to open a Pandora's box of hell. So thanks, but no thanks. So the short answer is, and normally on panels you come with like big success stories waving a flag, right? Well, I'm not. We were unable to take things forward for those barriers. It's a bold, brave, and scary thing to do, and at the time, you know, no one was up for it. So that's where we got to.
I think that goes in the category of non-solutions that we can learn from. But I want to come back now to sort of try to kind of take a sort of hypothetical case study and trying to get you guys to brainstorm around this about how these ideas might work in the real world. And we've done a bunch of work on EVs and the rate at which EVs are being accepted and bought. And there's a fair amount of evidence that a large-scale, quite effective, and quite targeted set of misinformation campaigns have emerged. Some of them from places in Russia, some from places that are harder to identify, that have said a whole bunch of negative things around EVs, some of which are grounded partially in the truth and have plausibility, but they're incredibly well designed to sow doubts about EVs. So they say the embedded carbon in an EV is more than an existing combustion engine, and therefore you shouldn't buy a combustion engine vehicle. You shouldn't buy them because it's just a big piece of greenwashing and a hoax. Secondly, their tires let off a whole set of particles and particulates that contribute to dirty air. You have to be aware of that. Thirdly, EVs are more expensive, and the range anxiety that you all are concerned about is real, and there aren't going to be the charging stations, and so you should stick with what you know. A set of quite targeted messages. And it's been designed to sort of support or slow down a transition to EVs funded by state actors, partly by fossil fuel interests. So we're trying to figure out ways to combat that. But we're trying to, on the positive side, go to a community and say, we want to roll out wind and solar and smart grids and EV subsidies as quickly as we can. And we want to try and do so in a way that it's going to involve a tariff that helps and a local tax that supports it. And in the medium term, costs will come down, but in the short term, there's going to be a tax and a tariff. And secondly, there are going to be some eminent domain and planning overrides which stop you as local communities being able to block this, because we need this infrastructure to go through certain vital areas if the smart grids are to work and if we are to connect them to wind and solar. And by the way, some of these wind installations are going to be unsightly on beautiful hills or off the coastline, but there's a collective benefit. How would you go about structuring those processes so that you get buy-in, combat disinformation, and strike the right balance between NIMBYism on the one hand, which we're trying to avoid, but also stomping on local citizens, which is something which happens more often. So we're now doing this together. So let's role play this out. Help us with the misinformation question.
I'm going to start by recommending something deeply counterintuitive. Right now, what happens when you see those conspiracy theories, disinformation campaigns, most of which probably have some factoid in them that is actually true, and around which is built a narrative that is false? It is our instinct as a community of experts to go and argue the case, to go and build a communications campaign that addresses head-on the misinformation and debunks it, and goes out and writes a counter article and shouts back in the social media spaces. But what we have learned over the last few years is that this is a failed strategy. And it doesn't work because what it ends up doing is it ends up putting more eyeballs on the disinformation than would have seen it otherwise. And at the end, people don't remember who said what or what the end result was, but they remember there was some problem with EVs. And this is a function of the information overload in which we live. I'll explain that just briefly by saying, I sit in conferences like this on the regular, as I'm sure many of you do too. It is rare to find someone who can last an entire hour without looking at their phone. Is there really something in your phone that you absolutely have to see during the hour? Maybe. Probably not. We are just so habituated to take the damn thing out and look at it that we can hardly help ourselves, even if we're really interested in what someone's saying on stage. Now, what happens when you look in your phone? Well, suddenly you meant to look just for a second to see if you had a notification, then suddenly it's 2 minutes and you've just consumed like 10 different messages and who knows how much notifications. Multiply that by 1,000 all day long for everybody in your community. You can't remember exactly where something came from that you heard. Marketers will tell you that the number of times they need to put an ad in front of you on a digital device to get you to have a persuasive effect is dozens. To sustain that persuasive effect, they need to give it to you every day, dozens of times. So the problem that we have is that we make a persuasive counter-argument once. It's not enough, and it doesn't work, and it ends up putting more attention on the thing we were trying to downplay. So what we have to do is pivot and say, this story about particulates in EV tires, I haven't heard that one, this is nonsense. let's talk about how clean energy is going to make your hospital better, because suddenly the energy costs are going to be lower and they're going to be maintained locally, and we're going to have a better health service. Let's talk. Let me find the farmer who's genuinely bought into the idea that she's going to give up land for that new power cable to go across it, and we're going to promote the heck out of that video. And we're going to tell the positive story, and we're going to spend as little time as possible engaging with the disinformation, and we're going to spend all the time talking about our positive message.
I love your idea. I love your idea. It's the reason why the Haitians eat cats and dogs. As absurd and factually nonsensical as it was, has ricocheted through all of our worlds, because all it has done is said there's something wrong with immigrants. It may not be factually true, but there's got to be something wrong with immigrants. So I like your idea, and if I'm doing that world, I'm not going to say, no, they never eat. Go to Haiti, they don't eat dogs and cats. It's ridiculous, right? So now you and I are in agreement. I'm saying let's not contest that nonsense, Ben. But they're doing it dozens of times a day for dozens of days in a row. In order for us to promote our counter-narrative, we need the resources to be able to do that. And the problem with this, as I understand it, or it's just I know it, is that we don't spend enough time or money or effort in the counter-narrative.
So we're going to have to fix that problem, but it is, on the grander scale of things, not that expensive. It is not a multi-billion-pound problem.
Right.
Let me give you a quick example. You'll have seen in the news the DOJ's recent reveal that the Russians were behind an influence operation where they paid $10 million to about 8 different right-wing influencers on YouTube in America to pump videos out promoting crazy things like cats and dogs. They spent $10 million over the course of a year, and so far we've been able to measure 1.1 billion views from those videos. That is a conservative estimate. It's probably 10 times that number. That's less than a penny per view. That's a heck of a deal. We can spend like that in more directive and less pernicious and obfuscating ways and get a similar result.
Okay. So if there's an idea to that comes from this, is we need to bake into our P&Ls, either as citizens or as foundations or as companies, an entire information effort to try and get facts across in ways that will create community consent. Now, that implies that these companies are going to be good faith actors, and we've just heard from Ben number 2 that in fact you're more likely in some instances to have assets allocated on the other side of these arguments. But I think if I'm going to take away something for the moment, one of the things I'm going to take away is that the good forces trying to build inclusive economies and good and net zero transitions take it as read that this is a good thing, and don't invest the time and energy in winning the fight of ideas in skewed information markets sufficiently. It's not on our P&Ls. It's a sort of externality, if you want to think of it that way. So we'll revisit that, but I want to now move to Claire. Tell me how I'm going to figure out the Citizens Assembly, because I think that there are reasonable disagreements about people in this community about who wins and who loses based on where you sit and what house you have and where the collective interest lies, in ways that maybe more platonic elected representatives will be better off making the decisions in the collective effort than this sort of messy process. And how am I going to build a consensus in that room and then get it to stick? Like, just tell me practically how we do it, because I'm enthusiastic about it theoretically, but when I think about it, it makes me anxious.
So in the same way, I think, where people need to hear the different perspective. That's at the root of a deliberative assembly. So you bring the range of perspectives, and at the moment there are academics who are saying, actually, we need to bring the conspiracy theory as part of the learning process of a citizens' assemblies, because some people in this assembly will believe in this conspiracy theory. So you need to bring the range of perspective. And they are, you were talking about the electric vehicles and the myth potentially around that. There are also some truth to that. So there are people who are saying, you know, the blind spot of the green energy transitions, and we're mining our way and genociding our way into the transition through rare earth extraction, etc. And there are really serious scientists demonstrating that. So we need to hear this evidence as part of the learning process of a citizens' assembly. And I think at the moment, we are not really pushing the boundaries of what we need to hear as evidence in assemblies. So that's the first phase. The deliberation is where people bring their own lived experience and grapple with it and come to not always consensus, but actually they can see through the eyes of the other person. So it's not always consensual, but actually you end up respecting the other person's different view on something. So that's what it's building. So if I go back to your question, when you're saying, can you delegate the power to a citizens' assembly and take it away from our elected representative? Is that the question you're asking?
Well, if you can persuade me it will lead to a better result, I might, as an elected representative, say, this is too thorny, send it to an assembly, and then we'll take their recommendations. I mean, commissions of inquiry, there are precedents for this in democracy. So I might be persuaded if you can persuade me that this is going to lead to a better result. And I like your deliberatives. I'm getting more comfortable with better conversation of all perspectives, even conspiracies, produce better outcomes. But are you proposing that? Do you want that?
I personally think what's needed is permanent chambers that are becoming part of our democratic systems, and that's being tested in places like in Belgium, for instance, where they've got a permanent assembly in East Belgium, or in Paris with a permanent assembly as well, where you can, it's not one-off. So you use citizens' assemblies as deliberative moments to tackle systems issues. I personally think that at the moment we're not ready to say we hand over the power to the citizens' assembly. I think we need still to actually reconnect with the larger democracy public. This is why, for me, the connection with the referendum is actually a really powerful one. But then you need to have the national conversation, which bring the larger public into the deliberation. And that's where Ben's work is so critical, because then you need informed public opinion. And at the moment, we are faced with the biggest systemic challenge. So, to be honest, we are prototyping, and I wouldn't say, look, deliberative citizens' assembly are going to sort everything out, but they are one of the best tools I've come across to really push the conversation and the needle.
Ben, do you think that you could use these fora to engender greater buy-in from your sort of somewhat jaded and skeptical view of what business is likely to do, and actually incentivize more pro-social behavior in instances where you haven't seen it?
I think we've got to try in the business world, because, as I say, businesses are more powerful than governments, and we need a different governance model to actually do that. In the case of this scenario, I would challenge your question. Behind your question is an assumption that EVs are good. I don't see ripping the heart out of West Africa through child labour and using precious resources so the global minority can drive Teslas around London as particularly good. So the whole question is the wrong question. And the question that we need to be looking at is how can we live in a world that balances planetary boundaries and social flaws equitably across the globe? And what that means is we need to reduce our consumption rapidly in the global north, and we need to get far better equity, racial equity, all kinds of equity, social equity in the global majority of the global south. So I would say it's the wrong question. I wouldn't want to engage in that question unless I was somebody who was bringing in the knowledge to challenge the assumptions on which it's based. We need a system of private sufficiency and public abundance in the global north, and that means reducing our consumption. EVs is most definitely not the answer. It's simply electrifying the Titanic.
Okay, so what you've just said will be deeply contested, but valuably heard through these processes, because if you and I were in a citizen assembly, I would probably get up and say, what the heck, and then I go, that's actually an interesting perspective. Can we explore the degrowth agenda? I'd probably not be persuaded, but I think everybody in the room would make better, richer, more informed decisions, and in fact maybe take on board some of the questions of circularity or slower paces of growth, or some of those perspectives where we could probably in a Venn diagram produce greater degrees of consensus. So I think there's something interesting about the architecture here, and I think another idea for all of us to take away is Claire's idea of beginning to deepen and enrich our democratic forms by taking citizens' assemblies and architecting them into our constitutions in ways that are more, you're hacking prototypes, but we can begin to say these things, if incorporated with the mini public and the maxi public, may lead to richer decisions if we actually make it as part of our decision-making process. It's part of our practice of getting from A to B is doing these processes. Now, I'm going to kind of take the opposite view for a moment and then maybe open up for questions. There's a version of this in the world, and that is planning consent. Like, to get the conduit up and running, we had to go and have a whole range of conversations with the Covent Garden Residents Association. Thoughtful, interesting people, but small groups of people, highly motivated, can insert themselves into deliberative processes in ways that I think there's strong precedent to say that they slow down development or slow down progress in moments where we're having to go quicker. Now that gentleman may say, actually, we want to slow things down because going quick is part of the problem. And other people may say, we have to get to net zero fast, and that requires these sets of existential investments, and we have to make them happen fast. The current Labour government, through its planning reform initiatives, has said exactly that. We are going to accelerate. And I'm wondering whether that balance can be thought about with greater nuance. When do we consult? When do we engage? When do we get consent? And when do we step above to say there's a collective interest which trumps these processes in a thoughtful way? Have you found good examples of that, of how we tackle that?
I think what I'd like to do actually is go back to a quote from the French Convention Citoyenne, because for me that illustrated the issue we're facing currently with the way these engagement processes are designed. And the French Assembly members, that was back in 2019, they started without having heard from experts, and one of the main statements that they all came up with across all groups was the obsession with growth, GDP indicators, and the logic of profits is a blocker to the transition. The logic of financial interest takes precedent over the common interest. That was a statement from actually the whole assembly, and that was parked because the process was not really about exploring what we mean by growth, degrowth, fairness at the global level in the context of France. So what I'm saying is that the current, who decides what's on the agenda, and what process, how is the process designed, and where does it land? These are the key questions at the moment that we haven't answered, and I think the power holders need to relinquish some of their power, and we need, I think, to trust the citizens that they have the collective intelligence much more than the people currently in power as elected representative.
Awesome. I want to turn over to you and ask some questions, because this has clearly been a meaty series of dialogues. Gentleman in the back.
Thanks to all the panel. Thanks, Ben, for that diagnosis of the misinformation and disinformation system. I just want to slightly disagree with the "and" statement around how we sort of what the steps we take next, and that £10 million example, because I think the information ecosystem that we have built digitally, the unconstrained actor always wins. That is what is baked into the medium, and even if we spent that £10 million, we would not win. Because what flies through that information ecosystem is always the outrage, the things that create kind of the attention, that get, you know, serious traction in the attention environment. And actually we've created an ecosystem, you know, perhaps by mistake, that we actually cannot win in. And that is a big problem. It's why, I mean, one of the reasons I do sort of fundamentally really believe in citizens' assemblies, and while that is very difficult to scale and get there, but the online ecosystem is in its current form is fundamentally flawed, and the medium, you know, as people have often said, you know, the medium is the message, and the medium for what needs to happen right now in terms of the transition that's required is entirely wrong for building consensus and for having that conversation online. And I think it is now probably one of the greatest barriers in the way of kind of serious action on the climate and nature crisis.
Perhaps take three, and then we'll just let everybody take a crack. Please, yeah.
Thanks very much. I really like the way, Paul, you asked that question about EVs, because it kind of shows us that actually the importance of the question, and the assembly itself would have a say in what is the exact question we should be asking. So it was just a beautiful example of that. And I noticed Asheen this morning, she was talking about local communities, local energy solutions, and doing that in a deliberative way. And she shone at that. Of course she did, because what she was talking about was citizens becoming part of the solution. And as I'm listening to you, Claire, I'm thinking the benefit is not just about getting policy recommendations, it's also about building local trust, or, you know, you're talking at a national and even a global level for assemblies, but the local ones, you mentioned the Humanity Project, it's also about building local trust, building local relationships, and building a culture of citizen responsibility. And that enters into a whole new story about citizenship and what you were talking about being the you know, focusing on the positive stories that are coming out of, you know, our societies and our local, you know, look at this farmer who decided to put their set-aside field into a community solar farm. So I think it does more than just the recommendations. Thank you.
Yeah, gentleman over here.
Hi, look, it's a lovely panel, great discussion. My question is perhaps for Claire. I love the idea of the citizenry collective model. My question is really, how do you bridge information asymmetries when you form your collective? So let me give you a concrete example. We talked about EVs. Perhaps the mainstream is that, and my assumption is that most people might think that EVs are a good idea, but how do you ensure that when you form your collective, that alternative opinion is there so that the collective is fully informed? Meaning, how do you ensure that the group is knowledgeable or has access to information about how the cobalt is extracted, or the lithium, or the tantalum, whatever it may be, the practices in the most remote parts of Africa that go as ingredients into that Tesla or whatever other brand. So how do you bridge information asymmetries and have more equitable access to information and diversity of thought from single mothers through to other parts of society?
Quick, easy, simple questions here. So solve.
Let me start. I'll respond to the first comment. As I understood you, your point is the digital media system at its core, has a business model that fundamentally rewards with audience and monetizes that which is most extreme and unconstrained. Preaching to the choir, you're right. Paul told me I couldn't come up here and tell you that it's hopeless, so. But here,
It just went totally off script. I mean,
but here's what I say. You're right, but the answer to that problem is a multi-year industrial policy, which I've spent the last 5 years working on and will spend the next 5 years working on. What I'm arguing for here is not to beat the system as it exists today without changing it. My argument here is that we must lose more slowly in order to buy us time to win in the long term. And I believe it is more complicated than just the most unrestrained and ridiculous actor gets the most audience. You do see anomalies in the matrix. So let me suggest one example. You know, when Gary Lineker, world famous footballer and host of Match of the Day, tweets out that the conservatives' refugee policy reminds him of the language of Nazi Germany, it creates a national focus on that issue. He's not a political commentator. He's famous because he's a footballer. And yet it focused more attention on that issue, and I would argue got more of a positive view and a sympathetic understanding of that from people who would normally not pay attention at all or have a polarized view. So that's an interesting example of how it doesn't always follow the most common pattern, and we can see the ways in which those breakages occur, and we can try to replicate them. It will not create a systemic advantage that ultimately allows us to win in the current circumstances, but it will allow us to lose more slowly and buy time, not only to fix the information market, but on the way to help make sure that big problems like climate are also not capsized.
Claire, composition of citizens' assemblies to be representative of all voices.
Well, I urge you to look at the globalassembly.org website, because that will give you probably the most striking illustration of how you bring together people. 10 out of 100 were fully illiterate. And what the evaluation showed is that these people were actually brought on this learning journey in the same way as everyone else. And we had highly educated people in that group of 100. And we had, assembly members at the start who said, climate change is God's will. I can't do anything. I don't believe it's a scientific, process. By the end of it, they went through a process, and their core beliefs to some extent were challenged, and they understood the science by the end of it, which is extraordinary. And so I do think actually the way these citizens' assemblies are designed are particularly good at sharing complex information and making it accessible and bringing a level playing field for people to grapple then with the trade-offs as the second phase. So I think that's, in a way, that's what the evidence and the research is showing across the board with all these processes.
I can't build on that.
We don't have time, but the remaking of industrial policy, how to lose slowly and win in the long term, where do people read about that? Where can people get to that? Because I think that that's sort of a slight elephant in the room here. Or give us, 4-word answers.
To my knowledge, there's no well-articulated theory written in a single tome or even a clever blog post about that. There are lots of people thinking about this and thinking about most of it is happening where the money is in the persuasion game, which is in politics and in marketing. That's where people are thinking about how to persuade in a distorted media market. And I think there's a lot of interesting lessons to be learned there. It's going to be deeply challenging for a long time, but it isn't hopeless. And there are traditional media still plays a powerful role in shaping public opinion. Leaders in public policy still play a powerful role through public statements and through the creation of narrative. But I think we have to think differently about it. The last thing I'll say here is, since a lot of you probably come from NGOs, I think we need to, and I had to make this transition myself as a movement guy coming from an NGO background. I saw my role as a watchdog of government. The job was to make sure government did not become too cozy with corporate interests and act at the expense of the public. But now what I see, particularly in governments like the one we have here or in the Biden administration, you have governments trying to do the right thing on hard problems, but they haven't the resources or the expertise, and no one's ever tried to do the things they're trying to do. And so when we come as NGOs, as watchdogs, and we whip them for failure, for not reaching the highest standard, we're actually setting back the cause. And we need to think about ourselves less as watchdogs and more as sled dogs. Government is not the enemy here. Government is the engine, and they need help. They need to be pulled in the right direction through things like citizens' assemblies, through things like better narrative building, through things like community engagement, to help people understand, why is it that Whitehall has decided X, Y, and Z for my community, and why haven't I seen them? Well, they don't have people to send out to you, but we do. We can go out to you. We can talk to you. And we can put that farmer up on a YouTube video and sling it around social media. Will it overtop the Russian propaganda videos? No, but it'll reach more people than nothing, which is what we have now. And these are the baselines against which we should measure.
Fantastic. Well, we've hinted at solutions. We've pointed at asymmetries. We've said we've got broader reforms, but I think we've given some very, very interesting insights about how to re-architect the process of taking citizens seriously and obtaining informed consent in ways that are better than the current systems, which have clearly failed. So for that, I'm incredibly grateful for the conversation. Thank you so much.